Welcome to the Happy in the Mess podcast. We are your hosts, Marlena, Cheri, and Matthew. We are therapists and coaches, and we want to share our own stories with you, as well as the wisdom, insights, and tips we've learned along the way. Thanks for tuning in to this episode.
Welcome to this episode of Happy in the Mess. We are so glad that you've come to listen with us today. I'm Cheri, and I'm here with our experts, Matthew and Marlena. We are all therapists and coaches. Today, we are continuing our series on mental health disorders. So far, we've talked about ADHD, anxiety, and the pros and cons of diagnoses. Today, we're going to talk about bipolar disorder. If you missed those episodes, go back and binge listen to them because there's a lot of good wisdom, whether you struggle with those things or you know others who do. As a reminder, please like, share, comment, rate, review, subscribe on whatever platform you listen to. It helps us get the word out and get these messages out to those who can really benefit from the information. As a reminder, although we are therapists and coaches, this is not a substitute for mental health services. And if you need referrals, reach out to one of us, or if you're in one of our areas, maybe we can work with you directly. But this is for informational purposes only. All right, so let's dive in today. Let's just start with the basics. What is bipolar disorder?
Oh, bipolar. You know what? Everybody knows what it is because the number of times, especially living here in Ohio, that I hear, oh, this weather is bipolar. Because it has really high highs and really low lows, which I, by the way, do not appreciate. Just
The
just saying
weather?
out there. Well, I don't appreciate the weather, for sure. But also that linkage, we have to be really careful about, using clinical terms in non-clinical ways. Um, Now, in essence, it really does kind of describe what an individual with bipolar goes through, because typically what we see is we see an experience of high highs and low lows with it, and oftentimes going between them. So it basically the episodes are, and I'm just rolling straight from the DSM because I figure that's easier. We'll stick with the clinical part here. But they've got, we've got a manic episode, which is usually that high point where everybody's top of the world. Um, I, I'll get letters from clients or messages from clients that are like page long texts with no periods in between. I'm like, oh, we're in a manic episode. Like it's just everything's inflated, everything's moving. And we get these on a fairly regular basis, and it to the point of it causing a detriment. And I always say that's the big thing because I'll get people who are like, yeah, I get these really high highs where like I get up and I get showered and I'm able to do the stuff for the day. And I'm like, that's not a high high, that's normal functioning, you know. Um, so, but we do get these and they do cause problems. Now sometimes we'll get what's called a hypomanic, which is that high, but not at a super high level, where it's just a lot of times I'll say it's more like an agitation. It's like everything's wrong, I'm growly, I'm angry at a whole lot here. So it might not be that, it might be a little bit below it. But also in conjunction with these, we also see depressive episodes, which very self-explanatory. We're depressed, we're feeling sad, tearful almost every day, no interest, a lot of anhedonia, no pleasure in what we do. Even beyond like an Eeyore moment, like we're talking like kind of really down. And so bipolar is that's the cluster of symptoms that we use to diagnose that, and there's more finery to there, but we don't need to necessarily go into that here. But that's kind of what we're looking at, that pattern. And then really it's caused by a neurochemical thing. And I always say there's a huge difference because we're going to say bipolar if they're reacting to their world, oh, this person got upset because I ran over his toe with the car, he's bipolar. No, like there's a good reason for that. Please don't run over people's toes to check and see this. So it's it's more than just this because at least in my experience, and this is unfortunately something I deal with and with a loved one, is that it's something that's neurochemical. So you can give this person $1 million and they're going to really like, life stinks, like, oh, thanks, that was great. Like it just, because it's neurochemical, it's not based in what's going on. Now it can feed that, um, but it is very much a brain disorder. And I think a lot of people struggle with that because they're like, can I just think my way through this? And generally the answer is no. So that's
Mhm.
my run on. Marlene, I don't know if you have anything to jump in or add, or
Yeah,
if I missed something.
I would say like the thing that distinguishes, because there's bipolar one and bipolar two, and the distinguishing factor between these two is really the bipolar two tends to be more on the depressive side, less having less highs, like you talked about. The intensity and the duration is shorter, according to the DSM. Hypomania usually lasts 3 to 4 days. The depressive episodes for both can last up to 2 weeks or longer. Although there is some such thing as rapid cycling, where like this could happen not necessarily within these time frames, but close together. You have these intensities very close together. And I would say that sometimes in with the manic episodes, it's often visible by others because there's rapid speech or there's like high risk behaviors. But sometimes for the people, in my experience, people experiencing the mania, it's fun and it's not necessarily seen as a problem in the moment. Maybe when they see the bill on Amazon, it becomes a problem. But
Gotcha.
yeah, sometimes this is the like fun part of this diagnosis, if you would, because it can be experienced as a high. And who doesn't like to feel a little bit euphoric sometimes? It's just that those behaviors are often accompanied by some negative consequences, and high risk behaviors being like spending, gambling, investing in risky business ventures, a lot of sexual behavior, sexual appetite. I mean, they're drug, goal seeking, staying up all night, multiple nights in a row. Decreased need for sleep, things like that. So when I've discussed this, also though I've noticed this is not a criteria per se, but what I've noticed a lot too with people who have bipolar is that they also have a big spiritual side, and there is a sense of deep spirituality and connection to the divine with some folks. And I know that that doesn't mean that if you have a connection to the divine, you have bipolar, not at all. I've just noticed that this tends, I don't know what that is necessarily, and also an artistic side. So it's not all like all diagnosis. There are some like nice things in here. I don't know how else to put it, but it's not all bad. There can
Some
be, yeah,
benefits to it. Yeah.
yeah.
So at its core, you've got the depression, and then you've also got the mania. The mania being that can look excited, that also can look really agitated. What about normal? When someone is diagnosed with bipolar, are they ever kind of in that mid range for part of the time, or are they either in the depressed or the manic stages?
They are in that normal, but that normal is almost always a transitionary normal. It's that switch from one state to another. Now we can't, like, if things are treated well and we're well balanced, that middle of the road can maintain longer. Which is the goal. Now the challenge that we see a lot of times, Marlena, you mentioned, like we get this manic episode where we're up for 3 days, we've now cleaned the entire house, the neighborhood, and now we're working on getting our gubernatorial election packet together, and like everything is just choom. um and then a lot of times when you get that point, there is typically a very rapid crash, so you might not see a normal. You might just drop right through it and hit the bottom. um if you don't go super high, then that transition back again. Sometimes I'll tell my bipolar clients it's like carrying a sheet tray of water, or a cookie sheet of water. Like you start to adjust, and as long as you do the small adjustments, you can kind of keep everything pretty well balanced. But what typically happens, something will knock it, and all the water will whoosh to one side. So you're like, oh, I got to quickly adjust, and phew, it all goes to the other side, and then eventually you end up with water all over the place.
Hmm.
I
Yep.
love that analogy.
Hmm. Yeah. And so,
So,
but like having, I don't have necessarily, I think Matthew is our resident expert here on this. But I've also noticed that there are like stability. There is some stability, and it may kind of go dormant, maybe a little bit, for a period of time. And when all the things in balance, and I often talk when I have a bipolar client, we talk about all the basics being met really, really well. Sleep is huge. Movement, just a routine and a regular rhythm. Untreated trauma can really exacerbate some of the symptoms of bipolar as well. And so working on those with someone who's qualified can be helpful in this diagnosis. Food, nutrition intake being adequate and nourishing. All of this, I noticed, like, just access to sunshine and outside is extremely helpful. And a really big one is laying off substance use, because that can really, this is a very common co-occurring disorder with substance use issues. And oftentimes people self-medicate because they find that this helps, or I think it gives the perception that it's regulating the symptoms of bipolar. It's usually making them much, much worse.
Yeah. And usually it seems like to the person that they're managing it, but the people around them are saying, you are not managing this. This is really out of control. Yeah.
And it also, like, I want to mention that this is a pretty serious one, and a lot of people end up in the hospital due to suicidal ideation or other just out of control behaviors that need more attention. Bipolar 2 tends to, from my research, tends to be one that ends up in with suicidal ideation more. But because bipolar 1 has those really, really high highs, they're more actually likely to complete suicide. So this is a serious thing. It does need management, clinical. Yeah.
Matthew, what do you want to add about treatment?
First of all, and I am very much, I know we talked on the anxiety episode about medication and how medication can help, but it can also be a hindrance. And we're really not in favor of that. Bipolar, and I'm going to say in most cases, at least on the outset, you really need some medication management and skilled medication management. The challenge, and it requires a full diagnosis. I always tell people the challenge with medicating bipolar is a lot of times remembering we're fighting on two fronts here, and a lot of times we'll medicate one front, right? Because our depressive side, it might be the side that we don't like. And so, like, okay, so I'm going to put some elevation in there medically, but the problem is that when we elevate, then our high goes that much higher. Or if it's in reverse, our low, if we try to medicate the anxiety only, right, then a lot of times our depression goes that much lower. And I've experienced where individuals have been sleeping for 17, 18, 19 hours a day. And I'm like, it's tough to feel good when you literally spend, your life as a cat. Although, cats don't seem to mind. So, there's some medication, and again, skilled medication, I think, needs to be a component, especially in the outset. And the problem with bipolar is it's really tough to cure it long term. So you may still need that medication management long term. But I think the other thing too with this, it's so important. I love parts language. Frank Anderson, Dick Swartz of IFS, I think they've given us a great skill set here, because we can almost interact with those parts. And if we can recognize that, like, oh, look, my mania side is showing up. Like, do I really need to buy 2/3 of Amazon and see if I can get it delivered tomorrow? No, like it's okay. My manic side needs that, but I recognize that he or she, that's what they're doing. Right. And likewise, when that depressive side shows up, it's like, okay, what do you need? What do you need right now? Right. Oh, look, you haven't eaten for 3 days. Maybe we should eat something well, and so developing that, I think in treatment, developing that language to recognize and almost ride those a little bit. And that's where you're balancing the pan a little bit more. And so, yes, and like everything else in this world, I'm so frustrated because I'm going through this in my life. Eat well, drink water, manage your stress, get up and move. Like the core things to every human being that we need to be doing.
Yeah, I actually met someone who had this diagnosis and did the self-care so well, was able to go unmedicated, although and had community and friendship. And I mean, beyond just solid basics. I mean, it was plus A plus plus with the basics.
Mhm.
So, and that's hard to do on your own. I mean, he had a community of support helping him get those high marks in self-care. But I think that's more unusual to see. I've seen one case of that, one in all my experience with this disorder. So yeah, not to be, yeah, like Matthew said, sometimes you really need skilled medication management in the beginning. And then often like getting your labs done and checking your levels, because we get adapted to certain medications and we need to tweak it for it to be effective again. I've seen that with bipolar too, like years of being on one and it worked well. Now they need a switch because they're metabolizing it differently or whatever. It's no
Yeah,
longer having this.
some of the medications for bipolar also need to be monitored regularly because they can affect your liver.
Yeah.
Yes, that too. That
Yeah.
too. And and antidepressants are counterindicated for it because so that can make it worse. And bipolar is one of the most misdiagnosed diagnoses. Often people slap on depression and it's not, or anxiety and it's not, it's both. And unless you have like the true assessment to know if it's both, then you might get the wrong medication, which then can make it so much worse. So
Yeah, I want to underscore this just for a moment. If you are bipolar and you were put on an antidepressant, it can throw you into a manic stage. And sometimes that's the only way people get diagnosed as bipolar. But being in a manic state can be really, really uncomfortable. There is that allure to it that it feels really good and it makes you creative and you get a lot done, but it's also so agitating that even that being in it has this price to it. So just watching, if you go onto an SSRI antidepressant and you start feeling really, really elevated, really great, then that may mean that there's a bigger problem. Let's talk more about this misdiagnosis because what I'm hearing from you guys is that this really doesn't go away. But I have known people who were diagnosed with bipolar or diagnosed with other things and end up with bipolar later. And so I do think that there's some trickiness around the diagnosis of it. What are people diagnosed with instead of bipolar that eventually later they might be diagnosed correctly as bipolar?
I mean, the anxiety, the depression, I think are commonly, because we tend to look at just the one half of it, is typically what I see. Sometimes we'll throw, give me a second, intermittent explosive disorder, which I don't know who came up with IED as an acronym for this. It's so sad, but yeah, kind of fitting. A lot of times we'll throw that on there because we don't understand that full range of emotion. We just simply say, oh, this person has explosive temper. And we see a lot of that in there. There is also it's a closely related one to this, and it's cyclothymic disorder, which is a cycling of moods. And they're not as expansive as the bipolar. It's kind of, and sometimes I'll refer to as bipolar light. We get highs, we get lows, but they're not to that extent. So I think that's one of the things we look at is how much is this disrupting life if we're really to look honestly at it.
Mm-hmm. I would say too sometimes because like in some episodes of bipolar, there may be it can be with delusions or hallucinations, and that can look like schizophrenia or some of the schizo types of diagnoses. And it just becomes very difficult to start telling things apart sometimes until you have a skilled clinician, maybe an assessment and time.
Okay.
And then I'd also say that when it comes to substance use disorders, to me that sort of trumps everything until there's some sober time to actually know, because I know that sometimes people will be given both and then they sober up and then there's no more bipolar, like that kind of presentation begins to disappear. So it gets complicated. It gets complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And trauma, I mean, we can't ignore trauma. Everything comes back to trauma. And not that all bipolar is trauma induced, because it is, again, it's a neurochemical thing, but there's a lot of high linkages to that. ADHD as well, by the way, which I just totally interrupted my own train of thought with that, so that's fitting. Is ADHD and bipolar can often be comorbid, but they can also exhibit some similar symptoms, so requiring that time. Trauma, I always say number one, I look for trauma. Number two is substance use, because those things mask what's going on underneath. So somebody may come in, and that might be the realm of things. We might look through the trauma, we might treat the substance abuse, and then still realize we're getting these big moods. So we're like, okay, now we're doing exactly what we need to be doing. We're moving through health and healing and getting you back to where you need to be.
So those are the things that you can be diagnosed with when it's really bipolar. I also heard you guys start to talk about what is called bipolar that may not be. I've met a lot of people that were diagnosed with bipolar, and then later they were like, "Oh, this is maybe that." What are the things that it really is that sometimes are labeled as bipolar that it's not?
That's a great question. And obviously we talked about the cyclothymia in there that can be part of it. Um,
You
and
also
I would
mentioned trauma as one of
trauma.
them.
Yeah, and trauma can be in there. Oftentimes I might look to like highly sensitives, oftentimes when they come to me, and highly sensitive is not a diagnosis. But it's interesting because there's a lot of kinship here, because number one is a lot of us worry that we are bipolar, but often when you get into it, it's us reacting to everything around us with it, but again, it's a reaction to that sensitivity. So if I'm overwhelmed, yeah, I'm going to get these moments where I'm anxious. We On our trip down to Cincinnati, we went to Jungle Gyms, and all of us, no offense to them, it's a wonderful store for some people, but I think all three of us had a collective experience of like this is not good, and we were all very reactionary with it. My son as well, he was with us, and he went into complete neurodivergent shutdown. I had to get him out of there. That's a reaction, right? That's not bipolar. That's us reacting to symptoms that are around us. So I think that can be one of those things that we see.
I would also add, we didn't mention this earlier, but borderline personality disorder, I've often seen people confused with the two, seeing charts from someone else and they were given bipolar when it's really borderline, or vice versa. That one's a hard one to tease apart, and that is beyond the scope of this episode to talk about. But I think the general message here, I hope our listeners y'all are listening to this, that it can look like it shares symptoms with a lot of other things. And so to really know what's going on is really to have a longer term relationship with the provider to understand what's happening over time, given and ruling out other factors, because this is a hard one to diagnose properly.
I also want to throw out that sometimes there are medical conditions or medication that can mimic this. I knew someone who had symptoms of, I think it's now called POTS, but in trying to diagnose that and then medicate some of the symptoms, they actually triggered some bipolar symptoms, and then she was diagnosed with that before they really came to an understanding of what the POTS was. Now, I'm hearing a lot of POTS-like symptoms in post-COVID, so I'm wondering how good they're going to get at differentiating these, or whether we're going to see a lot more diagnosis before they really understand what's happening. I guess I'd also like to throw out there that because I just had this experience with my daughter, she went into the ER with some physical symptoms, and when they couldn't figure out what they are, they're referring her back to a mental health counselor. Now, as her mom and as a mental health therapist, I'm like, yeah, this isn't really a mental health crisis. This is a physical crisis. But there's something very powerful in a negative way about going to a medical provider who does all of their tests and then says, oh, this is a mental health thing. This is depression. This is anxiety. This is bipolar, when really they just haven't figured out what's going on yet.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So let's see. What if you believe that you have bipolar, or by extension, what if you believe that a loved one has it? I see this a lot where someone believes that their partner has bipolar, but their partner won't go there with them.
Oh goodness. Yeah, that's a tough one. And this goes hand in hand with that high sensitivity that I work with, because the number of people who have loved ones that are either confirmed or suspect with bipolar is tremendous. And I don't know if it's just who I see, if that's the reason why they're in therapy or what. But a number it's an astronomically high correlation in my limited experience. And as well, and again, I think I said at the beginning of the episode, I do have a loved one that has a diagnosed bipolar condition, and he has done a phenomenal job at working with it, but was very resistant to that for the longest time. Number one, my goodness, we have got to continue to fight the stigma of mental health. Um, there is such a within the military community, it's huge because I do see people who are in that way. But just even in our daily lives, again, when we use bipolar as, oh, the weather term or things like that, or look at somebody and throw that around as a pejorative, that doesn't help the cause at all. Right. We need to really be able to label this thing correctly. And there have been some phenomenal, famous people who struggle with this. A lot of people, there's a strong linkage with Vincent van Gogh in his writing. I struggle because I want to pronounce it the Dutch way as well, Gough. But he's the people believe with his artistry very much that he was, most likely this was something that he suffered with. Our beloved Star Wars princess, Carrie Fisher, was very open about her struggle with bipolar disorder, addiction. Trying to think of some of the other ones.
Kanye West, apparently.
Yeah. Give me a second. Entrapment. I'm remembering the scene that I shouldn't remember. Catherine Zeta-Jones is one who has recently opened up about that as well.
Robin Williams.
Robin, that's a great question. Was it confirmed? I know he struggled definitely mental health wise. And oh my goodness, I'm going to tangent for one hot second here, because there was an episode of the Dick Cavett show where Robin was on there. And they asked Dick, he just asked him, and yes, I'm dating myself because I've said this, and we were watching it in rerun. And Dick asked him, he said, what's the struggle with being a comedian? He says, is it hard knowing like if people are laughing with you? And Robin finished it up. He says, yeah, you don't know if they're laughing with you or they're laughing at you. And it creates this emptiness. And it was weird. I mean, like you could almost see this palatable shadow just kind of come over. It's like, oh, it's like, what if somebody had caught it then? Right. So rolling back to your question, if we have a loved one that we suspect, I think number one, being as gentle as possible, loving, affirming, quit stigmatizing mental health disorders and acting like it's something that we can control. And again, bipolar is one of those, because it is neurochemical, it is outside of our control, right? It should be as normal as I goofed up and I tripped and I rolled my ankle, so I need to go get it taken care of, right? So if you can do that and just as gently as possible say, hey, look, we have concerns. Can we go? And I'm always a big fan of we. There does tend to be a gender that maybe doesn't seek medical help as often as another one. And oftentimes they really do need that support, rather than stigmatizing. You don't have to be strong. You don't have to go through this by yourself. Let's go sit in the hospital together. Let's go to the doctor together. Let's work on this together. Sorry, I went way tangent on that one, Marlena.
No, that's great. I mean, I agree. Getting rid of the stigma and making it a team effort, because it does affect, everyone in the household, and preventative care is way better than trying to do cleanup work later. And it may not, and it's something that you may have to live with, for the course of your life. And so getting under control sooner rather than later. And and figuring out what works for you and what doesn't. Some of it's going to be an experiment, especially when it comes to the medication piece. So yeah. And finding, and not just going, I mean, I know it's hard to find specialists for things, but not being afraid to seek out a second opinion if you're not sure about the first opinion, or if the first, because it can be difficult to find the provider that's listening to your needs and really treating what you came in for. So that may mean having to visit more than one provider to figure that out.
Well, I'll add, I'll add on the relational piece. You chose your spouse because they were wise and amazing and had all of these wonderful characteristics. Sometimes they can see things that you can't see in yourself. So if your spouse suggests that you have something, anything, it is to the benefit of your relationship if you believe them enough to go and get it checked out by someone else. Doesn't mean that you need to accept that what they're saying is 100% true, but at least hear the intention behind what they're saying of something's maybe off, something's not running smoothly. And so then go and talk to someone who actually can give you the information that tells you whether this is a problem or not. Your spouse will respect you and be grateful that you did, even if you come back and say, okay, I've talked with a professional or two and they all agree that this isn't the case. This is what's happening instead. So, all right, any final words on or tips on bipolar? Anything that we didn't cover so far in this episode?
I think, Marlena, I know you hinted this one. Friendships, relationships, bipolar is so destructive to these things. Not the person, the disorder is destructive, because they do have these high highs and they can very much be the life of the party, and then they turn around, they have these low lows, and oftentimes the parts can react in ways of shoving people away, hurting people, ignoring people, any number of reactionary things, and it will, and I've watched it happen. It will destroy relationships and it'll push people away. Even that hypomanic stage, when we get these anger moments, we might find ourselves releasing a lot of our anger and frustration unwarranted at people. So if you have a loved one, I think it's very critical. The hardest part is to absorb through a lot of that and get them to that point of getting help, but also using that as the, like, you don't put up the boundaries. You don't have a right to treat me this way. We have to treat it, right? But again, oftentimes being very careful not to ostracize people who are struggling with this. Be there to check on them. The low lows, they're not gonna initiate friendships. They're not gonna reach out. So you've got to be there very gently to reintroduce and reconnect, and that can have a life-saving effect on a lot of people.
Amen. I have nothing else to add. I feel like Matthew covered this really well. And remember, like, share, subscribe, and especially share this with someone who may need to hear it. And because it can be really helpful to start understanding what's going on both ends, whether you're living with someone who has it or if you have it yourself.
Thank you so much for both of your wisdom. I also want to thank you. I know that the work that you're doing with your own clients is just life-changing and transformational for them. And the work that you do really does matters to them, matters to their family, and matters to their community. So thank you so much for the work that you do. Thank you so much for tuning in today. We'll continue our discussion of diagnoses in the next couple of episodes. This has not been our main focus with our podcast, but we did get on this string of mental health diagnoses just because there's such a need for information out there. If you have if there are any topics you want us to cover, drop us a comment or send us a message and we'll add it to our list. If this episode was helpful to you, please share it with someone or share it on your social media so that other people can hear it. We will see you next week.